Whitechapel in East London. A hardline vigilante group is trying to impose Sharia law on unsuspecting members of the public.
Muslim area. Okay?
Not dress like that in Muslim area.
Only a handful of men are involved in the self-styled patrols. 5 have been arrested on suspicion of harassment. It's not just drinkers being targeted.
Yeah, you're a gay, mate. Get out of here, mate. Get out of here, you fag.
And women wearing skirts above the knee are also being harassed.
What would you do if strangers approached women in your family, publicly scolding them for not following religious laws that have no standing in your country? This scenario isn't hypothetical. It's happening right now across Britain, where men are confronting women for breaking Sharia law while walking freely in their own country. The most alarming aspect isn't just these individual confrontations, but what they represent. Communities so detached from British society that they feel entitled to impose their religious rules on others. These incidents didn't emerge overnight. They're the culmination of decades of policies that we need to examine honestly. For 30 years, Britain has been conducting a massive social experiment with its immigration policies, and the results are now becoming impossible to ignore. The footage of men aggressively confronting British women didn't materialize from nowhere. These attitudes developed gradually within isolated pockets of society that function almost entirely separate from mainstream British life.
These men claim they're simply tackling drunken behaviour where alcohol's already banned from the streets, but they do share many of the same hardline beliefs.
On a Friday night in East London, activists with a group called Britain First took to the streets for what they call a Christian patrol.
A new right-wing group has begun its own patrols, and it is targeting Muslims with prejudice.
Look back to the 1990s, when British policies began heavily emphasizing multiculturalism. The intentions seemed noble enough: respect diverse backgrounds, celebrate differences, and avoid forcing newcomers to abandon their heritage. But somewhere along the way, integration was forgotten. Instead of creating a cohesive society with shared values and mutual respect, these policies inadvertently fostered isolated communities with minimal interaction with British society. What began as cultural appreciation has morphed into something far more concerning. In certain neighborhoods across Britain, parallel societies now exist, where residents live under entirely different value systems. Many openly reject the principles that most Britons consider fundamental: equality between men and women, freedom of expression, and secular democratic governance. This segregation didn't happen by accident. Language barriers have played a crucial role, with significant portions of these communities unable or unwilling to communicate in English. Without this basic connection, meaningful interaction with the broader society becomes nearly impossible. How can you integrate into a culture when you can't understand its citizens? Housing patterns have reinforced these divisions. Britain now has neighborhoods predominantly occupied by specific ethnic or religious groups, creating physical boundaries that mirror the cultural ones. Children grow up in these environments, attending schools that often prioritize religious or cultural education over integration with British values, perpetuating separation across generations.
Drunken and disorderly behaviour.
Would you condemn then the more intimidating patrols where they seem to be trying to impose Sharia law in a part of London?
Alcohol is causing so much problems in the area. In fact, it's blighting the area. It causes crime, it causes people misbehaving and...
Not dress like that in Muslim area.
Only a handful of men are involved in the self-styled patrols. 5 have been arrested on suspicion of harassment.
Perhaps most alarming is the emergence of unofficial parallel legal systems. The growth of Sharia courts operating outside the framework of British law raises serious concerns about women's rights. These tribunals can impose rulings that directly contradict established legal protections for women in ways that would shock most British citizens. The warning signs have been flashing for decades: separate legal systems, explicit rejection of national identity, and increasingly bold demands that others conform to religious rules. Yet successive governments, paralyzed by fears of appearing intolerant, have largely looked the other way. This political cowardice has created a vacuum where extremist views flourish unchallenged. This political vacuum hasn't just allowed extremist views to exist, it's transformed them from private convictions into public demands. When did we cross the line from "I choose to follow these rules" to "you must follow my rules or face consequences"?
It's not just drinkers being targeted.
Yeah, you're gay, mate. Get out of here, mate. Get out of here, you fag.
And women wearing skirts above the knee are also being harassed.
Golding says the Christian patrols are a response to Muslim patrols, in which Islamic extremists have harassed people on the streets for behavior that they deem to be un-Islamic.
The footage of men confronting women on British streets reveals something far more dangerous than personal religious devotion. These aren't quiet believers practicing their faith in private. They're self-appointed enforcers demanding compliance from strangers. The escalation didn't happen overnight. What begins as a personal religious conviction can gradually evolve into something unrecognizable when left unchallenged. Social media has accelerated this transformation, creating echo chambers where extreme views aren't just normalized, but celebrated. Inside these digital bubbles, the most vocal and uncompromising voices dominate, pushing followers toward increasingly hardline positions. Young men who might once have kept controversial opinions to themselves now find validation from thousands of like-minded accounts, emboldening them to take these views to the streets. The statements made by these men expose their fundamental belief that women require male supervision and control. Their outrage isn't simply about clothing choices, it's about a woman's right to exist independently in public spaces without male approval. This attitude represents a direct challenge to the freedoms British women have fought decades to secure: the right to dress as one pleases, to move freely through society, to live an autonomous life. These fundamental liberties are precisely what these men are attempting to strip away. Religious extremism flourishes in this environment precisely because it faces so little resistance. The communities where these attitudes develop often remain silent, while the broader society hesitates to criticize for fear of appearing intolerant. This dual failure creates a perfect breeding ground for increasingly bold public enforcement of religious rules. What begins as disapproving glances escalates to verbal harassment, and ultimately to the confrontations we now see captured on camera. The response from British authorities has proven woefully inadequate. Government policy has swung between complete denial and superficial measures that barely scratch the surface of the problem. This inconsistent approach has created an environment where men feel not just permitted, but entitled to publicly attack British women for exercising their basic freedoms. The footage doesn't show isolated incidents, but the predictable outcome of decades of political failure. What we're witnessing isn't merely the actions of a few radical individuals, it's the inevitable result of Britain's systematic failure to uphold its own values. Recent polling data reveals a growing public concern about religious extremism and the collapse of integration policies. British citizens are increasingly outraged by those who openly reject the principles of a free society while simultaneously benefiting from it. This footage represents a crossroads for British society. The harsh reality is that without a robust defense of British values, these confrontations will multiply and intensify. Women's freedoms, hard-won over generations, will face mounting challenges from those emboldened by governmental hesitation. The fundamental question facing Britain isn't about accommodating diverse cultures. It's whether the nation possesses the resolve to protect the freedoms that make it worth living in for everyone. Britain must find the courage to stand firmly for the principles that have defined it, or risk watching those principles erode before its eyes.